O heavenly King, the comfort to the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us, and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O good one. Amen. See, the audio is going. Good evening, everyone. It's good to be here again together in our pavilion outdoors, continuing our class. And for those who will be listening later online, welcome. Before we jump into it, I was just reflecting a little bit on, I guess, the notion of tradition in the church before. And that sense of tradition, I believe in Greek, I know in the Russian, Slavonic, it very much comes from the word being literally handing over, handing down. It comes from that sense. Pridani peridat, and I think, is it paradosis in Greek? Something like that.
Close,
okay,
yeah,
there'll be correction notes online later. But it's that it's something that's given, that's shared, that we receive. And so one of the real benefits of having this type of classes together is to receive and to share from one another which we received. And so it's kind of not enough to just pick up the book. And if, in a sense, just like the Bible is read in the tradition, so is the book. And so I'm able to give and to share and to pass on a little bit of what I myself have received. And you guys will be able to share a little bit as well. And perhaps for those who are coming in or new to the church, someday you too will be handing it down, maybe to children or to godchildren or to others in your life. And there's that sense in which it's a living experience, and that it is personal. As we say, it's not just something that you read and you get it. And some of the monasteries, we know Abba Dorotheus, who we're reading, is part of this tradition that's carried on, and where there is something almost sacramental about the idea of the gathering, the synaxis, of the monks together with their abbot or their elder as they learn of something. One thing that struck me visiting the Holy Mountain in Athos in Greece was that there was almost, I don't recall ever being a sermon preached in the church. There wasn't, at least there, it wasn't the place where the gospel was proclaimed. But where was it? So afterwards they would have, of course, the readings. They would share a common meal, and the lives of the saints or some of the homilies or spiritual books would be read. But then usually once a week, if not more, there would be the synaxis, and the monks would gather together with the abbot or one of the elders. I'm sure the practice varies from monastery to monastery. I'm more familiar with one than the others, but then there would be this, the spiritual talk, and that's kind of how things were handed down and shared, that experience of the Christian life. And so just reflecting on how participating in it, and as we mentioned before, the choice of Abba Dorotheus, that we have a way of, I think especially as Western people, of getting too stuck on the head knowledge. So it's very possible to get, as St. Paul, I think, put at one point, being puffed up with knowledge, but that's not really what edify or the whole story. Of course, we love our dogmas. We believe that the right dogmatic understanding of who God is, of who Jesus Christ is saving. And yet, if it's divorced from the experience of the Christian faith, from living it, it cannot be it can lose its. This like the salt that loses its savor. So there's a danger you can become a zealot for orthodoxy, but not actually be for Christ. And in that sense of having everything, all the right knowledge of all the right facts, but somehow missing the heart of which is Jesus Christ on the cross, right? Giving of himself for the salvation of the world. He is the center, and in the same way we are called to enter into that experience of crucifixion, if you will, of cutting off our ego, our sinful passions, myself for the sake of others, for the salvation of the other, the heart that is broken, that is compassionate, that is crucified, that is suffering for the sake of the other. And in that spirit, we receive the dogmas, we live the dogmas, and we live the faith. So So in little ways, another, just if you could say, segue to what Abba Dorotheus is helping us to do, to acquire that heart, that truly Christian heart, that helps us to be able to receive and really live the dogmatic teachings as well. So any questions before we jump into this week's chapter? Anything on your minds? Okay. This is another great discourse. I know I say that every time. This is, but it's true. So this one is discourse number 6 on the refusal to judge our neighbor. Shouldn't we just stop right there?
Yeah.
What is it that our Lord says? Because in a number of places in the Holy Gospel, right, this message isn't just given once; it's sort of repeated in different contexts. But one that comes to mind is judge not, that you shall not be judged. For with the same measure that you measure, it will be measured back to you. His implication being on the last day. Maybe some could think of a few more, but there are a number of gospel readings in which this is. We think of the parable of the of the servant who had the large debt forgiven, yet would not. Well, that's in a sense not so much judging your neighbor, but in a similar sense, that idea that we're not to place ourselves as a judge over another, but God is judge. One is the judge. So let's jump in and be instructed, because this discourse too has some images that have stuck with me for years, and I hope will stick with you too. If we remember the saying of the Holy Fathers, brothers and sisters, and put them into practice all the time, it will be difficult for us to neglect ourselves. For if, as they used to say, we don't despise the little things and think they're of no consequence to us, we shall not fall into the great and grievous things. So he's actually here remembering what he talked about on conscience, that we want to not to be careless about little things, especially in matters that relate to sin and even how we relate to stuff and other people, because that can lead us to, first of all, toward despising others and then toward greater sins. So he's going to segue right in from there. I'm always telling you that bad habits are formed in the soul by these very small things. And we say, what does this matter? What does that matter? And it's the first step, because it's the first step to despising great things. You know how great a wrong it is to judge your neighbor. So he's saying, you know the gospel teaching here that we just recalled, so he doesn't repeat it. What's graver than this? What's more serious? What does God hate and turn away from so much as this? As the fathers, the Holy Fathers used to say, what is worse than judging rashly? Nevertheless, things that appear negligible, through things that appear negligible, a man comes to great evil. From accepting a suspicion against the neighbor by saying, what does it matter if I put in a word about my suspicion? In other words, if this idle curiosity, if I let myself become too curious about what others are doing, what does it matter if I find out what this brother is saying or what that guest is doing? From that, the mind begins to forget about its own sins and begins to talk idly about his neighbor, speaking evil things against him, despising him, and from this falls into the very things that he condemns. Because we become careless about our own faults and don't lament our own death, as the Fathers put it. We lose the power to correct ourselves, and we're always at work on our neighbor. This is the whole danger, right? I'm always concerned about everybody else's sins and that they're doing the right thing. You know, it's not only in church, but I think it's especially magnified here. If this person over here would only do right, if they just pay attention more in service and stand the way they should, and make the sign of the cross at the right time, well then I could pray easily. But instead of standing and repenting of my sins and entering into the prayers. But we don't just do that at church, do we? We kind of can do that at work, at home,
everywhere,
on the road, everywhere.
Yeah, on the road.
But he says, and Abba Dorotheus is very hard-hitting, isn't he? Nothing angers God or so much strips a man so bare or carries him so effectively to his ruin as calumniating, condemning, or despising his neighbor. Uses some big words here, but let's unpack this, because he talks about different types of judging our neighbor in this next section. So there's 3 distinct things here. The first is running a man down, which he's actually going to explain to be more like gossip, more like gossiping about the neighbor. Then the second is condemning him unjustly, and then the third and final one is despising him. So running a man down is saying that so-and-so told a lie, or got into a rage, or went a whoring, or something like that. And this is what he says, is that we can sometimes do it with sympathy, like we're pretending that we care about the person. Oh, it's so sad. Did you hear what happened to I don't know, Averkios over there? Oh, poor Averkios, he had a great fall. Let me tell you about. Okay, continuing on here. So that's the first stage. The second stage is condemning a man, saying he's a wicked liar, or he's an angry man, or he's a fornicator. Because in this way, he says, and this is, pay attention to how he forms it, because then we're starting to make a judgment about the person's soul, he says. It's not just that it was a single fall that we're seeing, but now we're saying, you're this type of person, or that type of person. And it, we all have that danger, but I almost remember back into college. It reminds me a little bit of going back to college and knowing some friends who were, either psychology or sociology majors. Sorry to pick on any, not that much, but it'd be like, oh, we can now that we've taken some class, I can go and figure out what type of person you are. Oh, well, you're this type of person, and you really think that or say that because you're this type of person. It's very, very undergraduate, I guess, to do that. But in another sense, where we're looking at the bigger context of judging is to then, but to say that even in whether there's a neutral sense or even worse in a negative sense, to kind of type a person, and that this is just the way you are, especially if it's about a sin. So that's kind of that next level of judgment, he says. So this is a very serious thing. For it is one thing to say he got mad, and it's another thing to say he's bad-tempered, and to reveal, as we said, the whole disposition of his life. It is serious to judge a man for each one of his sins, as Christ says himself. Hypocrite, first take the board from your own eye, and then you can see to take the splinter out of your brother's eye. Remember this as well from the Sermon on the Mount. So we'll continue with this image. So you see, it compares our brother's sin to a splinter, and our rash judgment to a board. Very nearly, the most difficult of all sins to deal with is judging our neighbor. Isn't it true? It's one of those that no matter how much success we might make in other parts of our life, in fact, the more success we might make in other parts of our life, the more we can be tempted to then judge others who then aren't living like they should be, like I am. Oh, God forbid.
Doing what I'm doing.
Right. That Pharisee who was praying and giving thanks to God for his own good works was not lying, but speaking the truth. He wasn't condemned for that. Remember, he's right now referring to the parable of the publican, the Pharisee, remember? And the Pharisee had done he'd been very diligent in keeping the law. But yet let's listen to where he went wrong. And there was the tax collector who had lived a sinful life. And remember, stood afar off, beating his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. But he talks about the Pharisee here. He says he wasn't condemned for doing those things right. He wasn't lying when he said that to God. For we must give thanks to God when we're worthy to do something good. So in fact, he actually said, he started off, okay, I give thanks to you, O Lord, that I could do these things. Because of this, he was not condemned, as I said, not even because he said, I'm not like other men, but he was condemned when he said, I'm not like this tax collector. That's an interesting interpretation. It was even more is when he made that specific to another person, that I'm not like that man over there, that he received the condemnation. It was then that he made a judgment. He condemned a person in the dispositions of his soul, to put it shortly, his whole life. Therefore, the tax collector, rather than the publican, went away justified. Nothing is more serious, nothing more difficult to deal with, as I say repeatedly, than judging and despising our neighbor. Why do we not rather judge ourselves and our own wickedness, which we know so accurately, and about which we have to render an account to God? Right? And this is what I often try to remind those who are struggling with this, and to remind myself. I don't have to give an answer to God for anybody else's actions. I don't have to answer for the president. I don't have to answer for the governor. I don't have to answer for the archbishop or anyone else, right? Who do I have to answer for? It's myself. Myself. Though St. John Chrysostom does say that a bishop or a priest does have to give some answer for their flock. So I think I may have a little bit more answering to do. But nonetheless, that's who we have to answer for. So why should we demand a reckoning from his servant, from God's servant, from his creature? Ought we not to be afraid when we hear Ought we not rather to be afraid if we hear of the fall of another? In this case, it says that a brother fell into fornication. If you knew what it says in the book of the ancients, in the saying, this is probably referring to the saying at the time, the collection of the sayings of the Desert Fathers, which they would have had. Remember that Abba Dorotheus is coming at the end, sort of toward the end of that. It never really ended, but I think he's closer to 600, where you've had a couple centuries of Desert Fathers before him. It says what it says would make you shudder. For an angel brought Isaac the Theban the soul of someone who had fallen into sin, and said to him, "Here is the person you have judged. He just died. Where do you order him to be put? Into the kingdom or into eternal punishment?" Wow. Can you imagine a more terrible situation to be in? Right? Can you imagine? So this is, in a sense, you've got a very vivid image of what we're doing. Right? Somebody falls into a sin, and the angel places him and brings his soul to us and says, "Okay, where are you going to put his soul?" And so he goes on. I'm skipping just a little bit down into the middle of the page. The holy man, frightened beyond measure, spent the rest of his life praying with sighs and tears and continuous hard work to be forgiven of this sin. And in spite of having fallen on his knees before the angel and been forgiven, the angel said to him, "You see, God has shown you how serious a thing it is to judge. See to it you never do it again." So what he says is, even though he was granted forgiveness, he never stopped, Abba Isaac never stopped repenting of this sin once he had the vision of how frightening it is to place ourselves as judge of another. And again, how much is worth repeating that every one of us will have to stand before our Lord. That's scary enough, because it's everything we lay bare. Our heart is open, right? Nothing to hide, no secrets. And as we emphasize, the whole understanding of salvation is that revelation is our whole heart ultimately with God. Is that the desire of our heart, to be with Him? Or are we weighed down by all of these sins and attachments which do not lead to the kingdom, the effects of the sin? And so we stand before Him. But if we place ourselves as judge over another, well, we're in a sense trying to tell God, I'm taken over here. I don't trust your judgment. I would do a better job. And that's a very scary thing. So on page 133, continuing the next paragraph, why are we so ready to judge our neighbor? Why are we so concerned about the burden of others? We're giving ourselves worries. We're giving ourselves extra stress, right? Like, why do we need to get so worked up about what other people are doing? This is part of the the wisdom and peace of the Desert Fathers. Of the blessing of minding our own business, if you will. It says, we have plenty to be concerned about. Each and every one of us has our own debt, has our own sins. It's for God alone to judge, to justify or to condemn. He knows the state of each one of us and our our capacities, our deviations and our gifts, our constitutions, our preparedness, and it's for Him to judge each one of these things according to the knowledge He alone has. Now the next section is going to continue, makes an important point that we can't always judge by appearances, nor can we always judge by the sin. It says it's not the same if two different people commit the same sin. He says that's not. And so listen to what follows. For God judges the affairs of a bishop in one way, and those of a prince in another. His judgment for an abbot is one, and for the disciple is another. For the elder and for the neophyte, for the beginner, for the sick man and for the healthy man. Who can understand all these judgments, except the one who's done everything, formed everything, knows everything? Only God knows each situation, every detail, every movement of the heart. I remember once hearing the following story. A slave ship, this is quite a remarkable story, and I may paraphrase it a little. A slave ship was put into a certain port where there lived a holy virgin who was in earnest about her spiritual life. So, in a sense, this was a woman living the life of a nun, though not in a community. But in the early church, you had the consecrated virgins, and so she was clearly someone with wealth. And she heard about the arrival of the ship, was glad, and wanted to buy a small serving maid for herself. In a sense, to rescue from slavery a young girl, and to bring her up. It says, "I will take her into my home and bring her up in my way of life, so that she knows nothing of the evils of this world." right? So that good intention to, in a sense, to adopt, to save this young girl from all of the terrible things and just hardships that could happen for her, and bring her up in a life of piety. So she sent and inquired of the master of the ship, and found that there were indeed 2 small girls who he thought would suit her. Whereupon she gladly paid the price and took one of the children into her house. The ship's master went away, but he had not gone far and met with him the leader of a dancing troupe, who saw the other small girl with him and wanted to buy her. The price was agreed and paid for, and took her in with him. Now look at God's mystery, what judgments it was, and who can judge from this case? So he says one of these girls is brought up by basically a saint, by someone who's living a life of piety. She has the Holy Scripture, she has the services, she's protected from all of these things. And the other is brought up with all manner of wickedness and worldly temptations around her. You know, she has nothing, in a sense, nothing going for her. So what can we say about this frightful judgment? Here are 2 little girls taken away from their parents by violence. Neither know where they came from. One is found in the hands of God, the other falls into the hands of the devil. Is it possible to say that God asked the same from the one as he asked from the other? Certainly not. Certainly not, he says. It's going to be a very different judgment because they're given such different circumstances. Suppose they both fell into fornication or any other deadly sin. Is it possible that they would face the same judgment, or their fall would be the same? How does it appear to the mind of God when one learns about the judgment in the kingdom of God day and night, while the other unfortunate knows nothing of it, hears anything good, but only the contrary, everything shameful, everything diabolical? How can he allow them to be examined by the same standard? The message here, what he's getting at is, don't just judge by the circumstances. You see somebody falling into sin or a sinful way of life, we have no idea what all the cards that have been stacked against them, what kind of family they grew up in, what kind of hardships they grew up in, everything that's there. And Abba Dorotheus says God only knows. So we just should not be trying to go in and make those kind of, those judgments on people, but to have the same compassion for every single person, to have that same compassion. Again, now remember, it doesn't mean, of course, that we go and participate in the way of life of sin. That's discernment. But it means that we don't need to go placing judgments about what everybody else is doing. Page 135. Wherefore a man can know nothing about the judgments of God. He alone is the one who takes account of all and is able to judge the hearts of each one of us, as he alone is our master. Truly it happens that a man may do a certain thing, which seems to be wrong, out of simplicity, and there may be something about it which makes more amends to God than your whole life. How are you going to sit in judgment and constrict your own soul? So he says sometimes somebody can make a mistake, but they had good intentions. And so how can we, even though they had sinned, God will kind of see, the mitigating circumstances. As I think Elder Paisius would sometimes use that phrase, like we can't see that, but God does. And should it happen that he has fallen away, how do you know how much and how well he did, how he fought, how much blood he sweated before he did? And so it's like you see someone fall and sin right before your very eyes, but you don't know the battle that went on in his heart or her heart. You have no idea of the struggle. So how can we possibly judge that? But God knows. Perhaps so little fault can be found in him that God can look on his action as if it were just. For God looks on his labor and all the struggle he had done before it, and has pity on him. And know this, and you know this, and what God has spared him what God has spared him for. Are you going to condemn him and ruin your own soul? Also that God has obviously given him another day, and who are we to say that he should now, face judgment? But God is giving him more time to repent, more time to, for whatever it may be. And how do you know what tears he has shed about it before God? You may well know about the sin, but you do not know about the repentance. And that's an important matter as well. All of this. So I've been talking a lot. Any questions, comments, thoughts before we go further?
You go first.
You raised
raised your hand first.
Okay. Well, I'm kind of a busybody. Like, I get involved in things that I shouldn't because I feel sometimes like I have an obligation. If I see something that I think is unethical or cruel or, causing suffering, that, I need to say something and, name it and make people face that something's wrong. And it's so opposed to what I'm hearing from this, because that's all about judgment, thinking that I know what's right,
Right. No, it's a good question, comma, that about how do we, sometimes we're motivated by a desire, you could say by a good desire for the improvement of another person or situation, but are we just, in a sense, becoming a busybody or getting involved in someone else's affairs? And I'd say there's a few, at least, principles that we can go to. One of which goes back to several talks ago. I don't remember exactly which one, but perhaps someone can help me. Where he talks about within the context of the monastery, he says, but sometimes we see a brother kind of failing in some way, and we want to give a word of advice or maybe correction or to assistance or encouragement. And he said we have to first test our heart, that we are able we're able to say that word without being worked up about it, to put in modern terms, without passion, I think you would say, without so much emotion, because if we're not, it could hurt, it could not be well received, and then it could be, and he says in that case, if you're in the monastery, it's better just to tell it to the abbot and let him kind of either decide or give you advice and then of course he follows and gives examples that he almost never did that, even though he's such a saint. But he doesn't say that don't do it, but he says really look at the state of your heart beforehand. The other one, which I would say is a little bit different but also worth examining, is if it's like a workplace situation or somewhere where you are given a specific responsibility over things, right? So if you have responsibility if you're like a manager and you have responsibility for those under you, that things are being done, ethically and correctly and so on, well, that also falls within, your range. It's not, say, being judgmental of people if the work's not being done right. You can still do your job without judging them, but if something's not being done right, you may have to address it. And I think there's certainly that certainly is a Christian understanding, because others could be hurt, things can go wrong if that's not. So I think you have to look at where your relation to that situation. Within, that's kind of, just to give examples within the church, because that's kind of where we are to do that. I often tell people if they're kind of troubled, we read things online about what some priest or bishop may have said over here or there or some other person, and I have to look at it and say, is that actually something that enters into my own realm of responsibility before God? Especially if it's another bishop, if it's another priest, if it's another situation, that it almost never does. Within the life of a parish community, you may be, say, a newer parishioner and you don't have any specific obligations, or maybe you're a Sunday school teacher and then you have kind of obligations within the sphere of responsibility, or maybe you're the head of a committee, or you're on the parish. So there can be different realms, and as the rector of the parish, then I have more responsibilities for everything that goes on, answering to the bishop and so on. Of course, we always have to look to ourselves, but I think that's another point to see whether or not you could say, am I just being a busybody about it, or is it actually kind of within my sphere of responsibility more directly? And I don't know, at least those two considerations are what I might say look at first. Yes, Dan, did you?
I was going to add in that I've been, for days, I've been rereading the same couple chapters in Monk of Mount Athos. And one of the final paragraphs in the section I've just been reading is about when asked about the topic, Dorotheus said God is unjust, there is no injustice in him, and yet he is not just by our standards because he sent his son to die for us on the cross, and therefore to assign human ideals of earthly justice to God is simply inapplicable.
Yes, no, that's absolutely right. Those of you listening, the book he's referring to is about life of Saint Silouan the Athonite. The same idea is one which is echoed throughout the tradition. Most comes to mind from Isaac the Syrian. Says it in a very sharp way almost. He says, don't say that God is just, at least the way that we think of justice. Because if God held us to our kind of justice, we could all be in hell. He would not have, he would not have become incarnate and died on the cross for our salvation. And so he really emphasizes the mercy of God and says that, of course, in a certain sense, of course, God is just. We know that's one of the attributes. But within our Orthodox theology, there's a notion that sometimes it's called apophatic theology, a fancy term, but that we have to kind of use some negation with the positive terms that we have. So if we're going to say something about God, God is good, merciful, just, loving, and so on. We have to clarify that it's not exactly in the way that we understand goodness and mercy and justice, because we have a reflection of that, but it's still of this world. Because even think of our notions of love, they get to it, they point toward it, but very often our understanding of love is yet imperfect. It's not in that fullness of the revelation. We could say the most beautiful revelation we have of what love is the Son of God with his arms outstretched on the cross for our salvation. And so that's kind of, in that sense, I think is a very important point as well in that, especially emphasizing the mercy. We can, it is a word of caution to us to become too zealous for what's right and crusading forward for things. It's good to want justice within society, within whatever sphere we're living in. I think that's both a human, in a human sense, and even in a Christian sense, that everyone should be treated fairly with respect. Treat others as you would want to be treated. We have to be careful about how we play that out, lest we somehow, in crusading for justice, we end up both either losing mercy or losing that sense of the human worth of every person. This was much of the theme of the homily last Sunday, was that when if we get too much into an abstract sense of love or justice, then it can go wrong if it's not connected to concrete people, with an actual concern for the real humans, every single person that we encounter. And it's only in that way that we don't say go too far off the field.
See if I can add something, because I think of reading this chapter for me was definitely very nothing sort of damning, I guess, because it was just like, oh my goodness, this has been me my whole life, judging people. But I think something that harkened back to an earlier chapter that he brought up very briefly, and I think it was Abba Dorotheus, where he talks about concealing the weaknesses of others, not just the sins, where it's like, because I guess I've never thought of myself as being a gossiper, because it's like, well, I don't necessarily spread around when somebody's done something wrong, but it's like, oh, so and so, isn't that interesting that they did that over there, or maybe they're particularly freaked out about this or whatever about that. And it was like, that's the same thing. That kind of really hit me reading this chapter, was just any sort of talk to another person about another person that is in any way this is
revealing the sin in some way.
Or even just their weaknesses or their shortcomings is that it's judging.
Well, that's a good point. It actually segues right into the next part, because we'll get to another story soon about just that very idea. So I'm going to the last paragraph of page 135. Those who want to be saved scrutinize not the shortcomings of their neighbors, but always their own, and they set about eliminating them. So if you want to be saved, don't scrutinize your neighbor's shortcomings, but your own, and work on those. Since such was the man who saw his brother doing wrong and groaned, "Woe is me! Him today, me tomorrow." You see his caution. So you see how how prepared his mind was, how he swiftly foresaw how to avoid judging his brother. When he said, "Me tomorrow," he aroused his fear of sinning, and by this he increased his caution about avoiding those sins which he was likely to commit, and so he escaped judging his neighbor. And he did not stop at this, but he put himself below his brother, saying, "He has repented for his sin, but I don't always repent. I am never the first to ask for forgiveness, and I'm never completely converted." So again, he's taking some more of the sayings from the Desert Fathers and just pointing out this, how we fight against that temptation to judge and to say, well, he may have fallen today, but I could fall into the same one tomorrow, and he repents, but I don't always. In other ways, I mean, there's different techniques to it. Sometimes it's helpful to even consciously find in the other person a virtue that we don't have, because almost everybody, we can find a good quality about theirs that we don't really possess, and it can take a little bit more. But they might be more. They might have a certain weakness, but maybe they're more gentle and understanding than we are, or maybe they've got more kind of persistence and kind of a firmness in their character in some ways, and there's little ways in which we can kind of fight back against those thoughts. So he says, "You see the divine light in his soul. Not only did he escape making the judgment, but he humiliated himself as well." I'm skipping down to the next paragraph, 136. "How can we put up with these things unless it's because we have no true love?" So this is where it gets to the next point about having the way to avoid judging our neighbor is to really cultivate a deep sense of love and concern for our neighbor. If we have true love with sympathy and patient labor, we shall not go about scrutinizing our neighbor's shortcomings. As it said, "Love covers up a multitude of sins," and again, "Love thinks no evil, hides everything," and so on. As I said, if we have true love, that very love should screen anything of this kind, as did the saints when they saw the shortcomings of men. Were they blind? Not at all. But they simply would not let their eyes dwell on sins. Who hated sin more than the saints? But they did not hate the sinners, all at the same time, nor condemn them, nor turn away from them, but they suffered with them. Listen to this. They suffered with them, admonished them, comforted them, and gave them remedies as sickly members so that they could heal them. So especially he's talking about, again, his context is very monastic in this regard, but he's mentioning that they didn't just kind of cast them off or write them off when they had fallen, but they did what they could out of concern and care for their salvation and kind of maintaining that. Of course, and he's saying, of course, these holy men saw what was objectively happening, but they didn't let that kind of blacken their hearts, if you will, against the other brothers and sisters. He says, "So take a fisherman. When he casts his hook into sea with a large fish takes the bait, he perceives at first the fish struggles violently, it's full of fight, and does not try to pull it in immediately with full force, lest the line would break." An interesting image. So it's like you got to catch a big fish on the hook. He said if you just try brute force, very often you're going to break the line. But you have to have some give and take, and in other words, to give it space. So have you ever has anyone here ever gone fishing? Yeah. So sometimes you have to let the fish wear itself out a little bit before it kind of becomes gentle, and you can bring it in more easily. And he says this is actually what some of the spiritual fathers and saints of old would do. And to make that, I'm going to just paraphrase a little bit, but it's like we come to it's like we come to God. And when we come to God, usually, especially for adults who've been away for a period, we've got a lot of issues, we've got a lot of baggage, we've got a lot of stuff to repent of, and oftentimes we are not able to face that all at once. It's just a reality, and God, He does that. He doesn't have us face it all at once, and He says, and the holy men, they don't likewise try to expose it all at once and say, well, you brother, you need to fix this and this and this and this and this, or take a hike. It's kind of what he's saying, because that would break the line. But rather, so they very gently give each person space to work on a little bit at a time. And they're going to fall, and they're going to get back up, and they're going to do it. but nonetheless kind of sticking with it. And the way that God stays with us, and that if we're so blessed to have that experience in the Christian life of having, finding a spiritual father, a priest who doesn't say just kind of, beat us down per se, but helps us to little by little to struggle and to, to make improvement at our own time. St. Silouan often talked about, I'm changing books, I have someone reading St. Silouan, but he talked about just with his father, and how when he was just living at home, he talked about his piety of his father, where one time he said, when I was a boy, I wasn't thinking about it, and I made this big meat dish on Friday, and so with our fast we normally eat meat on Friday. And he said his father he just ate it, quietly, didn't say anything, he seemed to be thankful and so on. And then he said he waited several weeks until St. Silouan was in the right mood, so that as a boy the father could say a word of correction about it, where he said it wouldn't crush him. He said, "Oh, would that I had such a spiritual father, or that I could be one, to wait for the right moment, that he could receive it without being crushed." Because he says if he would have just said it right then, he would have just gotten angry and upset and all these things. But his dad just ate the meat dish, and then he pointed out to him a week or two later, and he said, and then he was so edified by that. That's kind of the idea that he's getting at here. We'll continue on the next page. So the Holy Fathers, by patience and love, drew the brother. They didn't spurn him, nor show themselves unfriendly toward him. But as a mother who is an unruly son doesn't hate him or turn him away, but rules him with sweetness, and sometimes does things to please him, but also, corrects at times. I know. So they always protect and keep him, to gain hold on him, so that with time they correct the erring brother, and do not allow him to harm anyone else. And in doing so, they greatly advance toward the love of Christ. They put some caveats here. So the brother doesn't harm someone else, and so on. But but he's saying they give some space to work through it, not immediately just kind of crushing them. And in some of the stories of the Jesuit Fathers, you have those where, there's a monk about to leave because his elder told him, "Well, there's no salvation for you. You're a lost case. So just be it." And the Abba Macarius, so someone finds him along the way and encourages him to carry on. And I won't retell that whole story, but Abba Macarius prays that the elder would experience the struggle that the young monk had. And then pretty soon he finds the elder walking down the road to leave the monastery, and Abba Macarius finds him and says, No, don't leave. I just wanted you to taste a little bit of this so you could have more compassion. So we have all these edifying examples. But in this one he tells the story. What did the blessed Abba Ammon, do? But these brothers were greatly disturbed. So he tells the story then. One of the brothers, I guess, I don't quite know all the circumstances worked, but he had a lady in his cell. Right? Of course, the monks are supposed to have taken the vow of chastity, and everybody's quite scandalous because they heard the rumor that brother so and so was entertaining a female guest and who knows what else. So Abba Ammon, knowing this, says, "You see what with great love he corrected the erring brother. So knowing that he had the woman hidden inside a large barrel, he went in and he sat down on the barrel and told the others to search the place. And when they found nothing, he said to them, 'May God forgive you,' and in a sense rebuke them for judging the brother. And then they all leave." What is this? It kind of reminds us of an account in the gospel, doesn't it? Right, about Christ and the woman who had fallen into adultery. And so dismissing them in disgrace, he then called out to them that they should be not so ready to believe anything against their neighbor. By this consideration for his brother, he not only protected him after God, but corrected him at when the right moment came. For when they were all alone, he laid on him the hand with which he had thrown the others out, and said, "Take care for yourself, brother." And immediately his conscience was pricked. He was stricken with remorse, and so swiftly did the mercy and sympathy of the old man work upon his soul. That's also interesting. He just didn't really start berating him and call him out. He just put his hand on him, the same one that kicked out the others, and said, "Take care for yourself, brother." In the sense, I really know what's going on, but be more careful.
Wow.
And that way his conscience was so stung that he truly repented. Let us therefore strive to gain this love for ourselves, lest let us acquire this tenderness toward our neighbor, so that we may guard ourselves from wickedly speaking evil of our neighbor and judging and despising him. Okay, there's one last image here. So I'm going to I'm jumping to 138 at the bottom. Again, this is, I think, one of the classic Abba Dorotheus images. We've been talking about, as the end, the remedy against judging our neighbors is, of course, acquiring true love for our neighbors. And so this, he says, does anybody like math? No. So he's going to give us a geometry, geometry example. Every now and then we get something for.
You can picture it, everybody.
Yeah. So is anybody? So he said, remember the old compasses you could draw a circle with? Anybody actually use those? I don't know if they still use them in school, but it's this little device where you place the sharp side in the center, the center of the circle, and then of course the pencil side on the outside, and then you can draw a circle. So he's going to use this image here. And now I'll give you an example from the Father. Suppose we were to take a compass, insert the point, and draw the outline of the circle. The center point is the same distance from all the other points on the outside. Now concentrate in your minds. He says, now picture this. Let us suppose that let's suppose that the circle is the world, and that God himself is at the center. And that the straight lines from the circumference, you were to draw a line out from the center to the circumference, to the right. So kind of like drawing a radius line out to the center. These are the lives of men. And now he says, so imagine your point on the outside. He says, the closer you move toward God, the closer we come to each other. All the other points on the outside, right? And the more that we love our neighbors, the more that we kind of are close to each other, the closer we get into God. It's like the circle shrinks.
Oh, wow.
But if I don't love my neighbor, it's like I'm running away from other people, right? And as the circle gets bigger, as we want to keep more and more distance, right? Not figuratively, we're getting farther and farther from the center, right? We're getting farther from God. And so it's kind of, he geometrically connects the two commandments. Like the more we love each other, the more we love our neighbors, the closer we get toward God. The circle shrinks, kind of approaching that center. But the more we love God, the more we have to naturally love our neighbors if we're doing it in the right way. So I think it's a really strong image. It says, to the degree that the saints enter into the lives of the things of the Spirit, they desire to come near to God, and in proportion to their progress in the things of the Spirit, they do in fact come closer to God and to their neighbor. The closer they are to God, the closer they become to one another, and the closer they are to one another, the closer they become to God. Now consider in the same context the question of separation. When they stand away from God and turn to external things, right? It's like they're stepping away from the center. It's clear that the more they recede from and become distant from God, they also recede from one another. See, this is the very nature of love. The more we're turned away from and do not love God, the greater the distance separates us from our neighbor. If we were to love God more, we should be closer to God, and through love of Him, we should be more united in love to our neighbor. And the more we're united to our neighbor, the more we are united to God. May God make us worthy to listen to what is fitting for us and do it. For in the measure we pay attention and take care to carry out what we hear, God will always enlighten us and make us understand His will. So that concludes that chapter, but instead of a few very, 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 very powerful, and I think memorable images in that today. So other reflections, thoughts?
I think it's to go back to the point you were making earlier about trying to look at others with a sense of, you were talking about finding good traits in other people. It reminded me of actually I think it was St. Anthony, the story of St. Anthony, where he had gone to all these different elders, and like the honey of each of the flowers had gained something from each of them, and at some point he was just like, I've got it, like I have it all, like who's better than me, more or less. But obviously he didn't quite say it that way. But and God sent an angel who took him into the middle of the city, and I think it was a cobbler.
I believe it was a cobbler, yeah.
It was a cobbler. He went to a cobbler. It was just an ordinary cobbler. I think he was a married cobbler. And the cobbler would look at people, would look at all the people going by and say, they will be saved, I alone will not be saved.
I alone will go to hell.
I alone will go to hell. And that, like the angel was showing to St. Anthony, it's like, here's somebody who has He's not a monk. He doesn't live in the desert, and he's attained
A higher state.
and is closer to Christ than anybody. And he's just by looking and saying they alone will be saved, and I alone will go to hell.
Which was pretty. I mean, and it was. I think it was maybe in the Saint Silouan where it said, who could have hold the thought of Anthony in a sense after that, because that was a really, that's a very 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 heavy one. Saint Silouan was to kind of rephrase it, the same idea to keep. Well, it was the word the Lord gave to him: keep your mind in hell, yet don't despair. But it was particularly for one who has progressed so much in the virtue. Right, St. Anthony had acquired all of these virtues, and then of course what's the last one to overcome is pride and judgment, right? So you have such purity, such generosity, such in every kind of good thing, and then of course the danger is to then think I'm better than everybody else, and that's when such a word was given. And to St. Anthony, to say it's not even a monk that I send you to learn from, but to this layman working. The story of St. Mary of Egypt is also very similar, because the elder Zosimus had that same thing. He had been a monk from a young age. He'd become very holy, and he said he was tempted. What man can possibly teach me anything more? I love how it says that. And then of course God sends him to Saint Mary of Egypt, who was the repentant sinner in the desert. And so there's always something more to learn, and also not to that message of not to judge, especially not to judge by the externals, or even to judge in some ways, never to judge our own state. That's something as well. I mean, to be careful about even judging ourselves too much. We can always draw closer to God. We can always. To use another, while we're on the math examples, the other one which I think is actually useful for the Christian life, if anybody got to at least the first part of calculus, they're really into this idea of limits. There's something mathematically that you can get really, really close to a number with not ever quite reaching there. So you can be going as you're going to infinity or something, what the limit would say, well, what do you approach? But there's you never actually get there, you just keep getting closer and closer and closer. It's kind of like that. That's really one of the images of salvation, drawing closer to God. God is the infinite goodness, infinite everything. And we can become ever more like Him. We can become more and more like unto Christ, but we'll never become the perfection. We can share more and more fully in the life of God without exhausting it, without ever becoming satiated. And so that's also very, it's in some ways, just encouraging. People might say, "Oh, well, what about heaven? Won't you just get bored of it?" The saints say no. Actually, the more that we taste of the divine life, the more that we ever grow from glory to glory, becoming more and more like Him, ever drawing deeper into this, even in a sense, even for eternity. So we get kind of big there on that point, but I think I'm going to stop there. Does anybody any other words for tonight? Or that's very, very good. So I hope this is helpful. Say, well, why do we have a whole class on not judging? Shouldn't we have one on the Sixth Ecumenical Council? Well, as we said at the beginning, this is what we have to get down first before we can possibly, even begin to approach such other things within the right spirit, within that.
Wasn't there a quote that was in the bulletin a couple of weeks ago where it talked about that heaven can be gained through humility, because heaven was lost through the single sin of pride.
Yes.
And that's what this is. It's the whole issue of pride.
Mm-hmm.
And all of us, and if it's you can have all the virtues, but if you have pride, none of it matters.
Yes, so the quote that was in the bulletin some weeks ago was from St. John of the Ladder, and he was, on one hand, the word of warning to say that even, paradise was lost through a single sin or passion that was pride, he said, and then he had kind of a stern word on that, but he said, but that also gives us hope, because and he kind of has a question, well, doesn't that mean that we could enter paradise through a single virtue alone of that humility? And what is more the expression of humility than to not to judge our neighbor? So we'll end on that. It is true.
Ever blessed and most pure, and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, and more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim. Without corruption, thou gavest birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee.
Amen.